If it wasn't obvious already, I am a 3D artist, but I like 2D art and I can't draw, so instead I take pieces of 2D art I like and attempt to reimagine them in a 3D environment. I've done this with various styles from artists I appreciate, especially with swords. I've made plenty of those. One way I like to adapt 2D art into 3D is by animating the scene or using the original concept in an animation, and I thought Figel's illustrations would work perfectly for that. The goal of these projects isn't necessarily to make the scene look 2D. Instead, their main objective is to make the style of the scene match the reference images. I completed this first scene with the sole intention of animating wind, but my PC struggles with cloth simulations and I wanted more control over the animation. Instead, I used something within Blender which I think is quite underutilized: the lattice. The lattice functions similar to the warp tool used in photo editing programs, but in 3D space. I used 3 individual lattices to animate the cloak and 2 for each flag. Using 2 lattices with mirrored ends allows the animation to loop perfectly. To make the animation, create a wave shape in the lattice and move it through the object you want to animate. The majority of the objects in the scene were manually shaded to better match the original reference. By moving objects like the flags and the cloak, use a simple cell shader. Manually shading objects matches the style of the references better than automatic shading, which is good for objects which aren't going to interact with lights in the scene. Making the Hollow Mouse character was quite interesting as I got to assess the limitations of 3D art. Many of the shapes on the references were tricky for me to make in 3D, mainly the cloak, the ears, and the general shape of the head. Now I will curse you with knowledge that hopefully no one realized before, but the mouse has no arms. Otherwise, the only way you would ever see the arms is if they clip through the cloak. There were parts of the scene I had to improvise, most notably the sword and how it connected to the character's back, and the ground since I struggled to match the original style. I think my favourite part of the scene are all of the shells, which were made with spiral curves. This was just my first attempt at making this style and I enjoyed making it quite a bit. I moved on to this scene, which I thought was going to be equally time consuming. But no, it was more time consuming and harder on my PC. The previous scene had about 50 rendered objects, but this one had almost 400 thanks to the dense foliage. To make life easier, some of the foliage were rigged with bones. Plants with bones is not something I thought I'd ever say. The main character in the scene was also rigged, as I wanted to do a simple animation with him. I usually like animating each individual frame of an animation, but with a moving camera like this, I decided to stick to automatic in-betweens, which eases the character's movement from pose to pose. Something I noticed in the original reference image was the use of noise, which makes the background speckled, which had the side effect of drastically increasing the file size for each rendered frame. The objects in my scene, however, were not speckled. In hindsight, making every object speckled and more textured would have improved the render. Some of the colouring and texturing could have been a little bit closer to the reference, but I am otherwise happy with the result. The candles were sculpted by drawing details directly onto a cylinder. The ground was arrayed, repeating a pattern of tiles along the floor, and the gravestones were modelled, making each look unique in their own way. Towards the end, I manually drew in the grease pencil markings on the gravestones, and with a little bit of adjusting, I was finished. I quite enjoyed modelling the individual gravestones and colouring them in. Finally, the alleyway, the third illustration I wanted to banish to the third dimension. This was the scene I was most excited to make, since I had an animation planned out from the start, the plans of which only I can decipher. This environment was difficult to create since 3D art's limitations collided with the strengths of 2D art, such as the wall the character holds, the walls connecting to the roof, and how the shadow interacts with the environment. Despite this, I think these imperfections make the art even better, but requires a lot of problem solving. I used forced perspective to frame the scene in a way that better resembles the illustration and animated the focal length to zoom into the scene. Usually a higher focal length or orthographic view is better for 2D scenes, making everything look flatter, but I decided to make the moving parts of the scene stand out more, which is more in line with the reference images. To make the forced perspective work better, the girl also shrinks throughout the animation. The stairs are quite cramped, and if the character didn't shrink, she would be too large at the end of the animation. All of the black lines are grease pencil, which act as vectors in the 3D space, and are all animated through modifiers with varying uses. The part of the scene I was most nervous to do were the 3 characters and how they were animated. I referenced other illustrations by the artist to get a better idea of who these characters are and how they would behave in an animation. The orb robot acted robotic and was fun to animate. I attempted to make the cat move fluidly. The scariest of them all though, the girl. She was the make or break of the whole animation. If the animation was off, everything would have felt awkward. But I think it turned out well with my current skill level. Throughout all this, I added small details like the box moving and the little octopus robots. And then I was done. I'm quite happy with how it turned out. Now, I get to show some short behind the scenes stuff and point out the errors in my ways, such as the animation of the bunny character in the graveyard snapping from pose to pose as the camera goes behind the gravestones, not that you'll be able to see it normally, as well as shrinking overall, the girl's arms and legs shorten while stepping down the stairs. The mouse has no arms, right? But the girl in the alley has no ears. I modelled the ears, but they were hidden in the hair because I forgot to move them back while I was rigging, but regardless, you wouldn't have been able to see them anyways. The shadow on the ground also shows off what is actually happening with the geometry behind the wall where she places her hand. And now I don't have to live alone with this cursed knowledge, because now you'll know it too. I love animating and modeling things so much, and making this channel has given me an incentive to do more. I have so many things I want to make, so the whole style of everything will just be all over the place. I just want to learn animation because it's fun. It's hard to time-lapse these projects, especially since I would have to go through so much footage over so many days. It's quite difficult to put into perspective how many straight hours of work these scenes took. I think working in 3D space helps me visualize what I want to make, which helps me plan out most of the steps, something I struggle to do in 2D. But regardless, it's something I really want to do.